Our next speaker to talk about WebRTC for streaming applications is Chris Wendt of Comcast. He's not like one of those Comcast guys out there. So don't throw your stuff at him. As I had an awful. I was asking for a special number today because I had an outage, but
I am like one of those Comcast guys. So.
But Chris is he's a principal architect in charge of IP communications. He's heavily involved in standards, chairman of the SIP forum there too, and heavily involved in IETF. So I'll let you introduce yourself, but please welcome Chris Wendt. You can hold or you can use that one.
Thanks, Chad. It's great to be here. It's great to have such a great audience here and great facilities. I was going to talk about WebRTC for broadcast. So this is actually sort of a complex topic, and I'm going to do like a whirlwind tour of like streaming protocols and things like that. But it's not necessarily to talk to you about protocols. It's more from trying to give a little bit of understanding of a topic that sometimes isn't very intuitive, and that is streaming. So like normally when you look at video streaming, unless you're in deep in the protocols, it's sort of like I get video from point A to point B and I'm done, right? We'll talk about what to consider and what to think about and what WebRTC may or may not have to do with any of this. So when we talk about broadcast, sort of define what we're gonna talk about. Broadcast, usually it's one-to-many. The question here is, how many are we talking about? Usually broadcast is a one-way thing. Starting to become apps where maybe that's a little different, like Periscope, where you have sort of this messaging back channel. But for the most part, when we think about broadcast, it's a one-way. And then broadcast, it's real time, it's live. But the question is, how real time do we want it to be? I'm going to sort of coin a term because I like to do that, and this one just slipped off the tongue so well. The trade-off triangle. Dun, dun, dun. So one thing to really think about when you're thinking about streaming protocols is the trade-off between these three parameters. And I think this covers most of the aspects. There might be other dimensions that we might want to think about, but for the most part, it's how do you account for latency versus quality versus the scale. So from a high level, probably the most live broadcast things that people have experienced uses technologies involving basically HTTP-based streaming protocols. So Dash, it happens to be the latest and greatest specified versions. There's more proprietary versions that folks have used, but they're all generally the same basic premise. So you have a camera, you have this UNICAST stream, typically RTSP or RTMP is used and sent to an encoder that has the ability to encode multiple bit rates at one time. It creates stream fragments for each of those, and then it sends it to the origin server that takes these, and in Dash it happens to be MPEG-2 transport stream or MP4 file fragments. But it also has this mezzanine file that is essentially a list of URLs to all the different stream fragments. And that constantly gets updated. The client grabs the latest version of the mezzanine file, gets all the links, and then it can adaptively switch streams as your bandwidth changes. And as you probably know, This has been highly adopted on both the web and mobile, and it generally works really well. But the trade-off triangle, we need to think about latency, quality, and scale. Let's take a look. So from a scale point of view, you really can scale to potentially millions depending on the size of your CDN. The key thing here is the origin server doesn't get loaded. It's the CDN pieces that get loaded. It's all coordinated HTTP downloads. The clients know when they need to start downloading the next fragment. And it takes advantage of all the great HTTP tools that we use every day as internet citizens. From a latency point of view, though, generally larger fragments are better for quality, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I think last time I looked at the spec, 10-second fragments are sort of the recommended size, although some people try to push it down to 2 or 3 seconds. But there's this sort of chain that, well, not sort of chain, there is a chain of latency that gets built up where you have from the camera to the encoders, you're building a chunk of 10 seconds, and then to the origin server, you have a chunk of 10 seconds. You create the mezzanine file, then the CDN requests start coming through, and then the client is probably buffering another fragment. So we have this chain of latency. So really, even in the best case, we're at tens of seconds, maybe even a minute. For the quality side of the triangle, this is mostly guided by the bitrate granularity available. And clients can only really adapt on the fragment boundaries. So if you have hiccups in the networks, you really can only change every, if I start downloading a 10-second fragment, I have to actually finish downloading that 10-second fragment to start the next one. And HTTP is also a TCP protocol, so there is congestion issues, if there's hiccups in the network. And you potentially get the dreaded buffering. Overall, it works usually pretty well, but from a quality point of view, it's not fully saturating the channel. So scale is the big thing here. Quality is still pretty good. Latency obviously drops off. So I talked about RTSP and RTMP, and some folks may be familiar with that. WebRTC is related protocol to RTSP. It uses some of the same underlying protocols, but obviously there's a lot of new and interesting things in there. But why didn't those get adapted? And to delve a little deeper into that, it has to do with UNICAST and stream adaption. So all these protocols are primarily unicast, and what do I mean by that? Unicast, as I'm using it here, means that it's tuned to deliver media content over the point-to-point channel that from client to client or server to client, whatever the case is for your application. And they tune the delivery of the media based on the feedback channel. So the clients are actually talking back to each other. The receiver is talking back to the sender to provide feedback on how you're doing, how can I send more data, can I send less data, am I getting a lot of packet loss? A lot of different media statistics that helps you adapt very quickly to different network conditions. So this is a quick overview of the protocols. RTSP and WebRTC use RTP over UDP. RTCP is the stream feedback protocol. These are ITF-defined protocols. RTMP is over TCP, but it also has a built-in feedback channel. And Dash, you can sort of think about that as a pseudo feedback channel, but there's actually no messaging going back. It's purely just the client deciding which files to download based on the bandwidth that it thinks it has available to it. So what about WebRTC? That is, after all, the main topic of this. So, you know, what low-hanging fruit? Why don't we use WebRTC instead of RTSP or RTMP? I think some people are doing this. It's pretty straightforward, makes some sense. Generally, in any of these scenarios, you want to make sure that you have good bandwidth available. Obviously, the downstream will be affected if the upstream, I guess, has bandwidth issues, and you have some, issues with the quality of the original stream. But this is definitely a valid way to approach things. There's sort of a new thing going on in WebRTC. A network component called an SFU, a video bridge. And essentially what this is SFU, selective forwarding unit, is I take my incoming RTP packets from WebRTC and I replicate them across multiple clients. So I can create a video bridge, Hangouts. There's a company called Jitsi that was just acquired by Atlassian. They're heavily involved in building SFU. There's a number of people doing it. Seems to be definitely the future of video conferencing. Why, could we use this for a massive broadcast? We have to go back to the trade-off triangle to make that determination. So let's take a look. Latency. So WebRTC, as you probably know already, it was built to be two-way communications, or really N-way, I guess, if we talk about the SFU. Resource for the browser and mobile apps. So it's really focused, and the stack that Google and Firefox have built into the browsers have been very well tuned for low latency communications and video adaption. So great for N-way conversations without the satellite delay effect. So that, latency is obviously incredibly important there. However, it really, because we have latency, low latency, there could be some trade-offs for broadcast. So from a quality point of view, like I said, these protocols are great for optimizing adaptive transmission for the specific channel that the peers are communicating on. Or really, another way to think about that is it's shaping how the video encoding is happening to the network channel to sort of fill the bits into the pipe they have available at the time. That can be a detriment sometimes when you consider broadcast quality. So when you think about a good video experience, watching a movie or things like that, it's often about constant video quality and constant frame rates. And if you know anything about video encoders, constant video quality can often be very peaky. So like if there's a lot of motion or if there's complex scenes, the video encoder bit rate goes up to if you have the encoder set for constant quality. So you have these huge peaks, valleys, things like that, and that is really not very friendly for low latency applications. Obviously, you have a certain channel that you have to, and if you have this peak, it's gonna be hard to push it through. So the key thing to think about from a latency versus quality trade-off is that constant quality equals extremely variable bit rate. And on the other side of the coin, constant bit rate equals extremely variable quality. Those are the two ends of the spectrum. Obviously, most systems try to balance those things. From a scale point of view, that's sort of another interesting topic. WebRTC has this feedback channel per stream. So what are the implications for a conference call? So you have this single video encoder. and you're feeding it to NRTP or NRTP endpoints. You're also going to get NRTCP reports back and the single video encoder, and chaos ensues. So what's a lowly video encoder to do? Well, so in the standards, there's a bunch of work. I think Eric mentioned something about simulcast and SVC. That's sort of the latest and greatest. The Jitsi guys, who we work with pretty closely, have an implementation of simulcast in the video bridge. We've been playing around with that. SVC is another video encoder technology. So both of these, not unlike how Dash implements multiple bit streams, have multiple layers. So simulcast does it sort of explicitly, excuse me, explicitly where it creates multiple streams and sends them as different RTP streams. SVC is a little more complex and, well, sometimes even a lot more complex in turn, but it has a lot of flexibility. So you can create multiple enhancement layers is what they call them. So it's a single bit stream, but it has multiple enhancement layers that you can subscribe to. And that can be either both in quality or in frame rate, so temporal versus spatial, to use encoder terms. And that can be adaptively shared among all the participants. So if you have somebody on a very good connection, they can subscribe to all the layers or the highest bitrate layer and get a great experience. If you have somebody that's on a not so good connection, they can downgrade and subscribe to the lowest layer. And this makes the experience great for all, depending on their connection. But, so this does enable larger, the ability to provide a good experience to a larger audience. But of course, larger is relative. So from a scale point of view, we're really talking about tens, hundreds might be stretching it a little bit of participants, at least in the near term, depending on the capabilities of a PC or a mobile phone to encode multiple layers. And it also does have some impact to the SFU as well in terms of managing all the feedback coming to it. So can I have my cake and eat it too? Well, maybe. So one thing we've been thinking about is a hybrid broadcast solution. And this has some interesting things, but yes, maybe we can have our cake and eat it too. So the idea here would be that, you know, like from most broadcasts, you know, or at least the ones that people are doing generally, aren't going to have the millions of viewers. There are going to be a lot that are, you know, tens of participants or something like that. So maybe start with low latency, low participant count streams. And then, you know, like celebrity mode when somebody joins that everybody wants to see, the threshold happens, and then you switch to incorporate the larger latency dash serve streams. Another use case for this could be corporate presentation or call-in show. So, you know, you reserve the WebRTC streams for the participants that are actually talking or other things. And then, you know, for the other listeners, I mean, latency is basically in the eye of the beholder. So if it's delayed and I'm just listening in, do I really know that it's delayed? So that could be a pretty effective solution. So point is, when you think about your video streaming apps and what you require from this trade-off triangle, whether your latency is important, quality is important, or if you're trying to get good scale, it's important to consider all these factors and pick the appropriate tool. After all we have, you know, in the browser and mobile, we have all these tools available. We can build some cool apps and build great experiences. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Chris. Do we have any questions for Chris? One, go. Actually,
Thanks. So you mentioned the SFU as a way to bridge to multiple clients. Could you use that sort of as a CDN if you bridge them together or expanded that capability?
Some people have talked about that. Now the feedback thing gets in the way. I didn't go into all the details of why that would work or wouldn't work. There's a bunch of messages that come back, things like requesting iframes and other things you may have to synchronize. So I think people are looking into those architectures, but it is a complex problem. Hopefully we can solve it fairly soon, but again, I go back to the, you don't want to have a conference call with 1 million people in it. Obviously you'd have to tell everybody to hit mute and all that stuff, which is just a problem with 10 people. So, yeah, again, it goes back to with WebRTC, this feedback channel. So there is techniques that are being looked at that can solve those things. But if you're going to 1,000 people, you may just want to go the HTTP route.
We do one more quick question from Chris.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, how's it going, Chris?
You probably knew I was going to ask you a question about this, but great talk, by the way. I'm just curious, have you thought much about the role of CDNs in this? Because they add so much latency with the whole HTTP or MPEG dash, and our approach, what we're trying to do is like actually leverage the existing cloud networks that are there and then cluster the servers together with very low latency performance across and get large scale plus the quality and basically flattening your triangle. I'm just curious what you think about that approach.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's definitely a trade-off. So like the ease of delivering content is the benefit of using CDNs. Now, maybe in reference to that, his question as well, like I think people are thinking about maybe ways of sort of combining some of the feedback coming from clients and maybe trying to get a more low latency experience using WebRTC. But it's not so straightforward sometimes, and the devil's in the details. And this actually could be an interesting, I'm curious in WebRTC if we may want a more latent mode that is designed for broadcast, sort of like RTSP actually supports. Generally, there is a latent mode that allows packet retransmission and other things to get a better quality stream. So there's a lot of things to think about, but I think from a browser point of view, probably some of the thought was we have tools that can do HTTP download. We have tools now that can do WebRTC. Let's see how we can work with them together, and maybe things will evolve to incorporate some of the things that you're talking about there.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks.
All right.